English translation, 625th Contact, Part 1. Saturday, the 15th of August 2015, 17:44 hours.
Greetings, Pata, dear friend. It is my great pleasure to greet you again after more than 2.5 months, and to see that you are well. You are very welcome, my friend.
Here you come, dear friend, and I greet you with great relief and also with great joy. Florina and Njana have informed me about the health problems you have had and why you had to have a heart operation, which was due for years, but which you have always delayed against the advice of Eva, the cardiologist, and me. But now the necessary has been done, and I see that everything has turned out and been settled in a good way according to your condition.
You are probably right about delaying, but I think I was right to do so, even though your daughter Simyase has already recommended an operation to me. I had to take medication for my heart problems 53 years ago when acute attacks required it. At that time it was Ildaman, then later nitroglycerin, just until the 12th of June, that is, until the time of the operation. In addition, the development of artificial aortic heart valves was not as advanced at that time as it is today. I was also told by the heart surgeon that the lifespan or functional capacity of such heart valves was much shorter than it is today, being 15 to 20 years or even 25 to 30 years. So I think I was right to delay, because in the past, such heart operations were much more life-threatening and difficult than they are today. I also told Simyase, Quetzal, and you, even against your objections and offers of help, because as an Earthling I didn't want to have more rights than everyone else, that I would wait with an operation as long as it was possible for me from a life point of view, and that by then medical and surgical technology would have advanced so much that I would have a better chance. The three of you have also confirmed that earthly medical and surgical technology is developing and improving rapidly. But this year I had more and more frequent attacks of dizziness and fainting spells, which is why Eva was so close to me that after 2 admissions to the hospital in Winterthur and after a separate cardiological examination, which revealed the necessity of an operation, I booked myself into the University Hospital in Zurich on Thursday, the 11th of June. However, this did not happen because I had such a severe heart attack during the night of the 4th to the 5th of June that Eva put me in the car first thing in the morning and took me to the University Hospital, for which I am very grateful to her. If she hadn't done that and had not had her way, it would probably have been too late and I would not be here anymore, because the severity of the aortic valve calcification had progressed too far and without stabilization in the University Hospital. Well, it just so happened that the whole thing came faster than expected for me in terms of the necessary operation, which was announced over several months by increasing attacks. Suddenly it became acute, so an operation could no longer be postponed. If I had only gone to the clinic on the 11th of June, there would have been no early stabilization and probably no operation on the 12th of June, so that would have been the end. Of course, they examined me very carefully at the University Hospital and classified me as an emergency, which I also supported. So they kept me and stabilized me, after which I was operated on at 11:00 hours on the 12th of June, and an artificial aortic heart valve was inserted. Unfortunately, after the operation, due to cardiac arrhythmia, not everything went exactly as planned, and I also had to stay in hospital for a few days longer than planned, which was somehow to be expected due to the emergency operation. The doctors and the surgeon were at first unsure how the operation should be carried out before they made a decision and determined the type of operation. I then had to study a description of the operation and sign forms stating that I agreed to the operation and to any more serious changes to the operation. It was explained that 2% of the operations cause certain complications and 3% cause cardiac arrhythmia, and also 6% of the operations have fatal consequences within the first 30 days. So roughly 1 person in 1616.66 does not survive the operation during this time. Well, until last Sunday, that is to say the 9th of August, I was not feeling very good after returning home from the University Hospital. That is to say more bad and nauseous than good. But since last Sunday evening things have been looking up, so I can effectively say that I am finally feeling good again in terms of my health and my heart. So it is not necessary for you to bother about me in this respect, because I can judge very well for myself how I feel physically and consciously mentally, and can also say what my state of health is and how I am doing all round just good now.
To say anything more about this is probably inappropriate, because on the one hand, I see that you are well, and on the other hand, you have always explained your state of health and your entire condition to me so exactly. Precisely and clearly, because you have really always judged everything correctly in this respect, that I could only confirm the whole thing in each case if you allowed me to make a diagnosis. I would like to say, however, that I am surprised at your state of health, because after only 2 months after the emergency operation on your heart, which was not easy, you are really in an astonishingly satisfactory state of health. In my opinion, this is not self-evident, because even after such operations, the convalescence period can usually take many months, as I know from studies which I have carried out in this respect by means of secret observations, clarifications, and diagnoses with various Earth humans who had to undergo the same heart operation as you. I was able to carry out my studies through our highly developed technical possibilities in 2 earthly clinics, which carry out this type of operation for the purpose of implanting an artificial aortic heart valve.
Aha, I did not know that. But the doctors at the university hospital also told me that I should recover and not go back to work at full speed straight away. Now I have to take special medication, so also to protect against thrombosis thrombus. That is to say, a medication to prevent a blood clot from forming in a vessel. I have to take this until December and then 2 other medicines for life.
Which will be unavoidable.
I know, yes, and that with us Earthlings, long convalescence periods are necessary after such operations. I also know that. Christian K. also still has problems today, even though it's been almost 2 years since his operation, during which he didn't receive an aortic heart valve, but only a stent. And to what you said earlier about my behavior, I was never interested in saying anything other than what I myself could determine about my health and judge from my condition. Although I am not a doctor, my mind, my reason, and my ability to judge and perceive are well enough developed to be able to judge myself and my state of health, as well as what causes me health problems and what I can endure, bear, and achieve. And by what I lack, I mean, of course, only those things in relation to an ailment or disease that I am able to recognize and judge for myself intellectually and knowingly, without having to face a medical diagnosis.
I do not think there is any doubt about that.
Then what is necessary in this regard is said. Then I would like to talk about the articles of the Constitution and bylaws, as well as the other articles that Florina and Njana took with them the day before yesterday and sent to you for your perusal and evaluation. Concerning my article on environmental degradation, it is important for me to know if you have studied it, and if my information is correct, or if there are any mistakes.
Environmental destruction as a result of overpopulation.
The following article is a summary of prophecies, predictions and probability calculations discussed in various conversations between the Plejaren Ptah and Billy Edward Albert Meier regarding the environmental destruction of planet Earth as a result of degenerate, criminal and irresponsible machinations and behavior by the Earth-human overpopulation. The detailed data and facts specifically mentioned in the article correspond to the information and calculations of the Plejaren Ptah. The world will not end, but it will change very dramatically, as will also be the case with regard to the whole of humanity itself and its existence. The extent to which these dramatic and drastic changes will become reality depends both on how and to what extent the world's population increases, and thus the worldwide overpopulation continues to rise in the future, as well as on the extent to which the impairments, destructions and annihilations of nature, its fauna and flora, the climate and the planet, caused by the criminal machinations of overpopulation, continue to be irresponsibly pushed forward. At the forefront of the destruction of nature, flora and fauna is agriculture, as well as commercial nurseries, etc., but also many human beings who spread millions of tons of chemical toxins into nature and its fauna and flora, as well as onto and into food plants in order to make them thrive and grow and to protect them from weeds, grubs, and vermin. The incalculable masses of chemical toxins that are deposited in food plants of all kinds and then eaten by human beings cause them to fall ill, waste away, and ultimately die. And the fact that valuable plants, animals, lizards, insects, aquatic life and birds are also poisoned and wiped out by these chemical toxins is another unforgivable factor that must be blamed on agriculture and commercial nurseries, etc., on the one hand, but also on the agronomists and chemical propagandists and the chemical users among the people. This is because, on the one hand, as a result of their stupidity or greed for profit, they use chemical toxins without hesitation and introduce them into natural foodstuffs, and thus also into the animals that are kept and slaughtered for the meat needs of human beings, which then naturally enter the human food cycle, and thus endanger the health of human beings and cause damage to their health. On the other hand, it is also agriculture and other businesses that breed and fatten cattle, poultry, and all kinds of animals, whereby these fattening creatures are treated with various antibiotics as a prophylactic measure to prevent disease. The fact that these antibiotics are also deposited in the flesh of the cattle, poultry, and animals, and that they are reabsorbed by human beings when they eat them and create antibiotic resistance in them, so that they can no longer be cured of various diseases or protected from infections, etc., which often results in death, is of no concern at all to the cattle, poultry, and animal breeders. The main thing for them is only greedy financial profit, because from this point of view and way of acting, and thus in this respect they know no responsibility for fellow human beings, as well as for nature and its fauna and flora, which they poison and contaminate. And this will also continue for a long time in the future, so that many more extinctions, destructions and annihilations will occur in nature with regard to flora and fauna, just as many more human beings, young and old of all social classes, will fall ill and die as a result of the irresponsible, profit-hungry, or simply thoughtless, stupid misuse of antibiotics and chemical toxins. Well, those super sleuths who, despite their ignorance and stupidity, want to know everything better or are paid horrendous bribes for their claims of lies, are on an intelligence less wrong track, entangled in untenable lies or completely brain dead. This is because they believe, lie or fabricate primitively, stupidly, twisting facts and not understanding that fundamentally and first and foremost, the chemical companies and chemical producers would be to blame for everything. Thus, they attribute the blame for the prevailing disaster of all chemical-induced poisoning, destruction and annihilation of nature and waters, as well as for the extermination of thousands of vital insects, plants, birds, animals and creatures, etc., as well as for the poisoning of natural foodstuffs such as vegetables, berries, herbs, fruits, and all kinds of grain plants, solely to the corporations and other producers who manufacture toxic chemical products. However, The fact that all those human beings are irresponsibly and even criminally at the very forefront of culpability, who unhesitatingly use the chemical poison clubs and introduce them into the environment, into the natural foodstuffs, the plants and the waters, and thus into the whole of nature and its fauna and flora, and thus poison everything, is hardly mentioned at all, if at all. So it is not made clear that first and foremost the users and consumers of chemical weapons are the criminally irresponsible ones who poison everything, also human beings and the whole of nature with all its trimmings, and thereby provoke and produce diseases, epidemics, and even extinction, death, and destruction. First and foremost are agriculture and commercial gardening, but also all those human beings and authorities, etc., who just as thoughtlessly and irresponsibly spread chemical poisons in their gardens, fields, meadows and roadsides, railway lines, or in any other way into nature and the environment. So it is not first of all the chemical companies and other producers of chemical poisons that are spread into nature and its fauna and flora and also on natural foodstuffs, etc., for the purpose of faster and better growth, as well as for protection against insects and freights, but fundamentally the users and consumers of the chemical clubs. The chemical companies and other producers of chemical products, which are spread in nature and the environment, etc., come in second place, precisely because they are only the producers of the chemical substances, through the production and sale of which they make billions in financial profits. Above all the chemical poison bombs are mendaciously recommended by agronomists and propagandists, and are bought and used by farmers and gardeners, by authorities and companies, etc., as well as by private individuals, to promote the growth of vegetables, grains and other plants, and also as protection against insects and pests, whereby it is always financially horrendous profiteering or some other advantage that determines the course of action in this respect. So it is not the chemical companies and chemical producers who are at the forefront of the misuse of chemical means by which everything and anything is poisoned, but the farmers and the agronomists advising them, as well as the commercial nurseries, authorities, companies, and all those of the people who use chemical toxins for plant growth and direct or prophylactic plant protection, usually as a result of recommendations by agronomists, propagandists, and unthinking supporters from the people. And again, the truth is that it is the farmers and gardeners and the people in the first place who use all the chemical poisons propagated to them and apply them to the natural foodstuffs, such as vegetables, herbs, berries, fruit and grain, and poison them with the chemical substances. The fact is that every farmer and gardener, as well as every human being among the people, does not need to be propagandized into using chemical poisons to make the plants grow better and to protect them from insects, etc. Even if propaganda is carried out, every human being has his own mind, will, and a certain amount of reason, from which he is able to decide for himself what is correct and wrong, and what is irresponsible or responsible. Therefore, no human being is forced by any propaganda to spread any chemical toxins into the environment, into nature and its fauna and flora, because every human being can decide for himself in full responsibility without being influenced. Consequently, everyone is responsible for himself with regard to exercising and bearing responsibility or irresponsibility. Consequently, there is no excuse whatsoever if irresponsibility is acted upon. This applies equally to the use of antibiotics, because every human being who uses such substance is to be called criminal and irresponsible. So also every farmer, and with regard to natural foodstuffs such as vegetables and fruit, etc. Also gardeners who apply poisonous substances, as well as everyone else who treats cattle, poultry and other living beings with antibiotics and breeds, and fatten them for meat production and as food for human beings. So, in this respect, too, every human being decides for himself and on his own responsibility or irresponsibility whether or not he wants to use antibiotics and toxins and thus endanger the health of human beings and make them ill and even send them to their death. Basically, then, it is not the producers of the chemical growth and protection agents and antibiotics that are poisonous to human beings. Nature, fauna and flora. That is to say, not the chemical corporations and chemical producers, just as it is not the propagandists who are primarily to blame for the poisoning of natural foodstuffs. Nature and its fauna and flora, and even for their extinction, as well as the diseases of human beings. The truth is that it is the unscrupulous users and consumers of all the poisonous chemical substances and antibiotics that are used out of pure greed for profit, be it with regard to the irresponsible criminal application of poisons to natural foodstuffs of all kinds, or with regard to nature and its fauna and flora, or with regard to the feeding of antibiotics to cattle, poultry, and all kinds of animals and creatures whose meat contaminated with poison and antibiotics serves as food for human beings. If the whole thing continues in the way it has since the beginning of modern times, from 1844 to the present day, then Earth humans are threatened with a very evil future. And this is also the case with regard to overpopulation, because if nothing changes for the better in this respect, by drastically curbing worldwide overpopulation through a strictly controlled birth stop and a controlled birth regulation, then the world and its humanity will face a very evil future as a result of their globally destructive and destructive as well as irresponsible machinations. What is threatening in the future, and will most probably become reality due to the manifold crass egoism of the human beings of the earth, as well as due to their lack of understanding and irresponsibility, and what can be carried out in addition in a prophetic, predictive and probability calculating form, is additionally the following. Even today, unteachable so-called experts who are often paid by corporations for false claims, lies and trivializations of the effective truth regarding climate change and thereby profit financially. Negate climate change or the associated consequences with erroneous claims that the whole of climatic change is completely natural and normal. To the same sort of people who trivialize the actual facts belong all those know-it-alls and wise slogans from the people who, due to their stupidity, do not recognize reality and its truth and live dreamily in illusions of an intact nature and its fauna and flora, as well as a completely natural climate change and a healthy world, but also a better, good and healthy future. And unfortunately, there are far too many of these kind of know-it-alls who walk blindly around the earth and do not perceive the effective reality with regard to all the destruction and devastation caused to the world, its nature, fauna and flora, as well as to all waters, primeval forests and other forests, meadows, seas, floodplains, glaciers, landscapes, and the climate, etc., by the criminal machinations of massive overpopulation. To this end, Stupid speeches are made, such as that in the last 2,000 years alone, there have been several phases of global warming or cooling, and that plants would benefit from an increase in CO2 in the atmosphere. Of course, in global terms, the average temperature at the time of the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages was higher than today, because there were also higher warm periods then. But this cannot be compared with the consequences of today's climate change. If we go back even 6,000 to 7,000 years, then there was also a warm period at that time, which led to the Arctic being largely ice-free. But if we go even further back into the past, then it can be scientifically proven today that at the time of the dinosaurs and all other prehistoric animals, the amount of carbon dioxide was 4 to 6 times higher than it is today, which of course also had an impact on all the genera and species of the plant world, which showed gigantic growth. With climate change and the related global changes, the food and water crisis as well as the natural disasters, major problems of the present and the future must be addressed. Because when everything is looked at closely, it becomes clear and obvious how much strain is being put on the environment by overpopulation and urbanization. In particular, all of humanity, as well as all of nature and its fauna and flora, as well as the planet itself, are being affected by climate change caused by human fault, with erosion and desertification as blatant consequences of overpopulation machinations wreaking just as much havoc on the entire ecosystem as monocultures and the cultivation of plants that are in demand on the world market. And the fact that the plants still grow locally at all is like a miracle, which only happens through the absolutely conscienceless and ruthless exploitation of the Earth's, soils, nature's, forests and water's resources, whereby for this, however, more and more stretches of land are rendered completely barren and lie hopelessly fallow, above all in developing countries, which are mainly exploited and robbed consciencelessly and criminally to the last by in every respect well-off large and billionaire corporations of the rich industrialized countries. This is especially true for the impoverished and sick human beings of the third world and developing countries, who have no chance to defend themselves because the governments of the countries are usually so corrupt that they simply let their own people die in their misery. The increasing environmental pollution, environmental poisoning, and environmental destruction caused by the cutting down of virgin forests has become extremely problematic for nature and its fauna and flora, and has led to great destruction as well as tremendous climate changes. If the future of the Amazon rainforest is considered, up to 60% will have been irrevocably destroyed by the year 2030 due to the unconscionable and criminal deforestation of the same. If we look at the primeval forests in Asia, it is clear that 3/4 of them have already been hopelessly cleared and destroyed. But the deforestation catastrophe is also spreading in Africa, and on an extremely serious scale, because currently only 8% of the primeval forest is still untouched. The fact is that every year as much primeval forest is destroyed and destroyed worldwide as 3 times the area of Switzerland, which is 41,285 square kilometers, if the mountain areas are not included. This means that around 125,000 square kilometers of primeval forest are destroyed and destroyed worldwide. Every year, see Appendix, end of article, area of Switzerland. Of course, this has devastating consequences for nature and its fauna and flora, but also for the climate and the oxygen content in the atmosphere, which is vital for all life forms on Earth. The fact is that tropical rainforests produce 40% of all oxygen. Despite this, however, the rainforests are being unthinkingly and criminally plundered, destroyed and completely annihilated for the sake of filthy lucre and profit. Every year, huge areas of primeval forest fall victim to mining, slash-and-burn agriculture, the timber industry, gas and oil production, but also to the construction of hydroelectric power plants. Many virgin rainforest areas that have been cleared and continue to be cleared are being planted with various plants that can be used to produce biofuels, with more than half of the newly reclaimed land being misused in this way. The destruction of tropical rainforests with timber harvesters, etc. alone accounts for about 25% of global CO2 emissions. If we look at the developing country Indonesia, which is the third largest CO2 producer today, the peat fires there currently cause emissions of 800 million tons of carbon dioxide. If CO2 emissions are considered in relation to the coming deforestation of the tropics as a whole, then between 100 and 130 billion tons of CO2 can be expected to be produced by the year 2100. Calculations show that if sugarcane or oil palms were planted to replace the deforested rainforests, a period of 50 to 120 years would be needed before the CO2 emissions saved by fossil fuels and deforestation could be recouped. If maize or soybeans were planted as a substitute, it would take 400 to 1,600 years. It is not only the rainforests that are being burned and destroyed, but also large areas of bush and shrubland, steppes and forests, both through lightning strikes and also through the fault of human beings, who carelessly, wantonly, and irresponsibly start bushfires and forest fires. But more and more often, bush and shrub areas, as well as forests, are also deliberately burnt down for criminal, commercial, speculative reasons, in order to create increasingly scarce building land for factories. Houses, settlements, sports grounds and roads, etc. The whole thing being founded in the irresponsible degenerative measures and needs of the overpopulation that is still rampant worldwide. If nature and its fauna and flora are considered, then the very strong decline in biodiversity that is taking place due to the destruction of the environment is to be denounced in a frightening manner. In relation to all the approximately 32 million genera and species of plants and animals, more than 2/3 live in the primeval forests, many of them threatened with extinction or already extinct due to the criminal deforestation and clearing of the rainforests. New natural pathogens also play a very important role in the overall threat and extinction of plants and animals, as does the spread of alien species from other ecosystems, displacing and even eradicating native plant and animal species. In particular, the future will bring with it that in gardening and agriculture, weed species native to the area and also introduced from foreign countries through globalization will become rampant, proliferate and can no longer be controlled with herbicides, and thus can no longer be eradicated, consequently letting the fertile land go wild and degenerate into infertility. The reason for this will be found in the fact that weeds of all kinds change in such a way that they become resistant to all herbicides or weed killers and spread in such a way that they displace the valuable food plants and deprive them of the necessary space to thrive and live, which of course has an extremely negative effect on natural food production, Already today, various weed species can no longer be controlled because they have changed so much and adapted to the chemical. Toxins through the irresponsible worldwide chemical use of herbicides in the course of the last decades that they can no longer be eradicated. And this is already the case worldwide with various weeds. For example, with regard to the palmer foxtail, Monsanto's palmer foxtail, glyphosate pigweed, Roundup-resistant monster plant, new high-tech weed, weed from the Orcas and not to be killed, was brought in from South America and is displacing, choking and wiping out all garden and agricultural plants, which is spreading catastrophically over square kilometers in various places in the USA. This is also common to many other alien and native weed species that are already herbicide resistant or will be in the future. In Europe, too, there are already a great many plants and animals, all kinds of insects and other creatures introduced through globalization, whereby these, according to precise Pleiadian data, are to be comprehensively calculated with a total number of 12,000 with regard to all genera and species. Since their deliberate introduction or involuntary introduction, many of them have already become so acclimatized that it is impossible to imagine the European ecosystem without them. And this will continue to be the case in the future due to globalization and the associated introduction of plants and all kinds of creatures. If we consider the many foreign plants that have been introduced into Europe, then there is also a great evil in this respect today, such as with regard to the golden rod, a composite genus with around 80 mostly North American species. Perennials with undivided, alternate leaves and golden yellow flower heads, which originates from the USA. The species common goldenrod, Solidago gigantea, Solidago canadensis, grows up to 1 m high in dry forests and bushes and runs wild on wasteland. Also to be mentioned is the Balsamina impatiens glandulifera, herbaceous plant, genus Balsamines, mostly found in tropical Africa and Asia. The seeds are ejected from their fruit capsules when touched or when they burst open due to seed ripening. Balsamines, si nolimetangere, rurmikniktan. Furthermore, the wild-growing ragweed Ambrosia artemisiaefolia, Greek, immortality, Greek, food of the gods, which originated in North America, is also a plant. Greek mythology, food of the gods, which gives them eternal youth and immortality, which can hardly be stopped today. In addition, there are numerous other plants that have been introduced into Europe, as well as other countries, such as the giant hogweed Heracleum mantegazzianum, which also grows up to 5 meters high, and which requires a special description because it is more than just an annoying weed, but must be described as an invasive neophyte and as an invading new plant that spreads and leaves no room for other plants. Its seeds fly out and germinate especially often along streams and rivers, as well as on fallow land and roadsides, but also find their way into gardens. It settles there on nutrient-rich sites that are not too dry. Each plant produces between 10,000 and 50,000 seeds, which can even float. In human beings, it causes severe burns on the body if they come into contact with the sap of the giant hogweed. Affected people first feel a burning sensation on the skin, and then a swelling that can go as far as the formation and detachment of blisters. Depending on the exposure to sunlight, the most severe manifestation is reached after about 2 days. The sap of the plant contains so-called furanocoumarins, which in combination with sunlight lead to second-degree burns. Sunlight thus plays the decisive role in causing the phototoxic reaction. After contact with the aggressive sap of the giant hogweed, the main thing is to avoid sunlight. Sun protection should also be continued after the reaction has subsided. The symptoms can be treated on an outpatient basis with painkillers, cortisone cream, and cooling. The rise of ever more extreme weather conditions also leads to further disasters, as does the loss of fertile land, the immense pollution of the waters by chemicals, human and animal excrement, household waste, industrial waste, plastics of all kinds, antibiotics and artificial fertilizers, etc. Also the acidification of the oceans, etc. The application of pesticides, herbicides, neonicotinoids, and all kinds of other poisons, as well as industrial and heating fumes and emissions from cars and other combustion engines, endanger and destroy biodiversity. Around 50,000 species of all genera and species of amphibians, plants, animals, insects, reptiles, beetles, aquatic life and other creatures of all kinds together are disappearing every year. And if this continues at this rate, then it is absolutely possible that by the year 2100 half of all genera and species of all living creatures, such as plants, animals and creatures, etc., will be extinct. Expert calculations speak of approx. 30% of amphibians, 24% of mammals and 12% of birds. This also includes marine life, whereby it is calculated that if overfishing is not stopped, no commercial fishing will be possible by the year 2050 at the latest, because the oceans and all waters will be completely fished out. If this actually happens, it means that more than 1.5 billion human beings will be deprived of the only source of protein on which their lives depend. This, in addition to the fact that the entire majority of earthly humanity will also no longer have any possibility of using fish and other marine and aquatic life as food. If we look at environmental pollution in third world, developing, industrialized and newly industrialized countries, we can see that it is growing inexorably due to the increasing extraction of raw materials and rapid industrialization, even though environmental pollution has been reduced over the years in the OECD countries. In addition, it is worth mentioning that when such resolutions are passed, the whole thing is not even a drop in the ocean, because during the time until such resolutions are implemented in reality, 10 or 20 years, etc., the world population grows by another 100 million per year, which means that by the time the resolutions are implemented, they are already very much outdated, and the problems are many times greater than when the resolutions were passed. If, in addition to all natural and unnatural deaths, an average of 100 million human beings per year is assumed in accordance with today's global population growth, then the increase in overpopulation for the next 35 years up to the year 2050 will amount to around 3.5 billion, 3,500 million more human beings populating and harassing the Earth. If thus in 2015 the earthly human being is in truth to be calculated with a number of more than 8.5 billion, 8,500 million, according to exact Playaran clarifications and contrary to the false calculations and claims of the earthling statisticians who assume only about 7.4 billion, 7,400 million in 2015 and believe that in 2050 only 9 billion human beings would populate the Earth, Then, in 2050, there will be around 11.512 billion human beings overpopulating the Earth and, with their degenerate machinations, wreaking much more havoc on all of nature, fauna and flora, on the climate, on the oceans and waters, on the land, on the Earth itself, and on the already very poor moral quality of life of human beings. And this is because the actual evil is not being tackled, and only the symptoms are being combated. Because basically, the source of all the evils should be tackled, namely the rampant overpopulation, which continues to grow inexorably and is not being stopped by global birth control. To the whole of the worldwide miseries and catastrophes, it must also be said that, among other things, the dismantling of trade barriers promoted by the World Trade Organization WTO has led to many states undermining laws on environmental and consumer protection. Not only nature and its fauna and flora suffer, but also the climate and the entire planet. And of course the human beings, because their health is damaged immensely, whereby air pollution plays a decisive role through which up to 4 million human beings die worldwide every year. In addition, it is also to be deplored that worldwide and per year about 16 million human beings die of diseases caused by the consumption of chemically and above all bacterially contaminated water, as well as equally contaminated food. The situation regarding drinking water will become very precarious and paradoxical, because on the one hand, water will become increasingly scarce due to persistent droughts, while on the other hand, heavy rainfall in many places will lead to hundreds of thousands of human beings having to worry about their drinking water because it is poisoned by fertilizers washed in from commercial gardens and agriculture, etc., and toxic algal blooms will also occur on an enormous scale. Drinking water is poisoned by the many chemical pollutants in the soil and water, especially by chemical fertilizers such as phosphorus and nitrogen, but also by pesticides, herbicides, and neonicotinoids used in horticulture, agriculture, and all kinds of plantations. Of course, the chemicals also get into the groundwater and thus back into the drinking water cycle. Especially in warm weather, all these chemicals cause an explosive growth of cyanobacteria, or algal blooms, in the open waters, which are also used as drinking water sources. Visually, this manifests itself as a bluish-green discoloration of the water, as well as streaking and a greenish carpet of algae on the water surface. All this bacterial growth poses an acute threat to human beings because the bacteria produce various toxins that naturally poison the water, which, when drunk or also used for brushing teeth or cooking, causes diarrhea, vomiting, and nausea, as well as dangerous damage to the liver and kidneys. Heating and boiling the water increases the concentration of toxins considerably, so that the situation may be even more dangerous than it is when the water is used without heating or boiling. It is also to be deplored that the production of rubbish is increasing immensely and uncontrollably worldwide, especially in the industrialized countries, whereby on the one hand less and less space can be found for open rubbish dumps, which in any case poison and pollute the environment and spread diseases, while on the other hand far too little is done to process the accumulating rubbish of all kinds in a correct and useful way. Processing waste in the correct way means that all that is turned into ashes can be burnt, detoxified and reused in some beneficial way, while all that can be reused is recycled, reprocessed, and fed into new production. Instead, however, on the one hand, The entire environment is being polluted by the ever-increasing amount of waste worldwide. Because it is simply thrown into the fields, waters, seas and forests by irresponsible citizens, who thus endanger nature, fauna and flora, and the entire ecosystem. On the other hand, it is also the authorities and governments, as well as waste disposal companies, that act criminally and irresponsibly with regard to waste disposal, namely by shipping the accumulating mountains of waste to poor countries, as well as to emerging and developing countries, which themselves have a large amount of waste that they cannot cope with. The fact is that in these countries, only a small part of the rubbish is collected, while the enormous rest is simply thrown onto the streets, fields and meadows, as well as into local waters and the oceans, polluting and poisoning them and the entire environment. In particular, plastic and other plastic waste is extremely problematic because, depending on the type, it only decomposes completely after 100 to 700 years. This type of waste in particular accumulates in local waters and in the oceans, and already forms carpets several square kilometers in size in certain ocean drift current eddies. But that is not all, because in the course of time, the plastic and other plastic waste is ground into fine powder by the wave, movements of the waters and seas, as well as by the UV light of the sun, and thus gets into the food of the fish and other aquatic beings on the one hand, and on the other hand also into the food chain of the human beings who eat fish and other aquatic beings. It is also to be said that environmental pollution of all kinds is not only causing the death zones in the waters, on the land and in the oceans to progress extremely rapidly, but also the poisoning and destruction of fertile ecological areas, which are of extremely great importance for biodiversity. Such death zones, caused by enormous environmental pollution and over-fertilization of agricultural land with nitrates and phosphates, etc., currently cover more than 3,200 square kilometers worldwide. And this in addition to the fact that these fertilizers are washed into streams, rivers, lakes and seas, and cause enormous damage to them by creating huge algal carpets, which impair and even kill aquatic fauna and flora. Plants that have died in the water, as well as aquatic animals, etc., need bacteria to decompose, which require so much oxygen for their own existence that it is no longer sufficient for other aquatic life and aquatic plants, so that neither fish nor crayfish and mussels or other aquatic life can continue to exist, let alone natural aquatic plants, except for certain destructive algae. It is also to be said, however, that these death zones appear especially in warm and hot seasons, such as spring, summer and autumn, because as a rule at these times the waters are not whipped up by storms, which normally ensure that the waters are saturated with much more oxygen than is the case in storm-free periods. Besides the catastrophic pollution and destruction of the environment by earthly humanity itself, as a result of all the irresponsible machinations by the excesses of overpopulation, the Earth and all life is being affected by climate change, which alone makes the future of humanity look very bleak. And as I said, earthly mankind itself is to blame for this. Because CO2 emissions have increased immeasurably due to the emission of carbon dioxide caused by all kinds of exhaust-emitting machines, forestry, trade, heating, industry, coal and other emission-generating power plants, as well as agriculture, billions of private households, car, diesel train, aeroplane and ship traffic, as well as senseless and irresponsible motorsports, and so on. These have caused climate change, along with various other factors that damage nature, its fauna and flora, and the health of human beings. And the fact is that these CO2 emissions are constantly increasing in relation to the growth of the Earth's population, much more than they correspond to the stupid and false forecasts calculated by would-be experts, who are always completely wrong with their stupid claims because they do not take into account the constantly growing overpopulation, which amounts to around 100 million per year in their crazy calculations. As a result, there is also no radical countermeasure adapted to the circumstances, which can only be based on curbing the earthly population growth precisely in the form of a globally effective and state-controlled birth control. And since this is not happening, CO2 emissions will continue to increase drastically and probably double within the next 15 years, which will inevitably lead to more and more frequent climatically induced natural disasters and cause immense destruction, both to nature itself and to human achievements. And it will also be inevitable that countless human lives will be lost, just as it will be inevitable that, as mentioned above, the emission of carbon dioxide will become more and more prevalent, precisely because the increasing energy consumption will rise immeasurably, because, according to the population growth, more and more human beings will need more and more energy. Of course, this will not only be the case in the industrialized countries, but also in the overpopulated emerging countries of China and India, which together have a population of almost or around 3 billion. And if the economic demand for energy in these countries is also taken into account, then this results in an enormous mass. And the toxic and climate-destroying emissions from coal and oil-fired power stations for electricity generation, as well as the production of aluminium, glass, steel and cement, etc., can no longer be justified, nor can the production of all the goods needed by the entire earthly human race. In this respect, too, carbon dioxide is being emitted on an enormous scale, not only in the newly industrialized countries, but also in the industrialized countries, because in both the richer and the poorer countries, the ever uncontrollably growing overpopulation is increasing, and with it consumption. And if we look at all the emerging and developing countries, we can see that they have a lot of catching up to do with the industrialized countries, because they do not want to lag behind the rich countries in any form of development, and therefore also justify growing consumer spending, precisely because they are clamoring for the same expensive standard of living that prevails in the rich industrialized countries. So it will be that in the coming time, more and more passenger cars will also increase CO2 emissions, as will pollution and the destruction of nature and its fauna and flora in relation to the increasing overpopulation. In the coming period, therefore, CO2 emissions will increase very dramatically in line with continued rampant overpopulation. And since the oceans are already largely saturated with CO2, they will absorb less of it. At present, it is still the case that of every ton of CO2 released by mankind, a little more than half enters the atmosphere, while the rest is taken up and absorbed by the world's oceans. However, the waters, that is to say, the oceans and also the land waters, are already so saturated with dissolved CO2 that they can absorb less and less carbon dioxide, which means that the atmosphere is becoming more and more polluted and overloaded and harmful to the health of all life forms. Climate change is doing its part, Because as the surface waters of waters and oceans become warmer and warmer, the water circulation slows down so that the surface water sinks less and less into the depths. As a result, carbon dioxide is no longer transported into the depths, and nutrient-rich water can also no longer rise. This, of course, means that the phytoplankton receives less nourishment, which has very negative consequences for the oxygen production of the world's oceans, as well as for the fish stocks and other aquatic life, for whose food chain the plankton is of great and fundamental importance. In addition to carbon dioxide, mankind on Earth also produces other gases, such as methane and nitrous oxide, which pollute and poison the atmosphere and, of course, also contribute to global warming. Of course, there are also the aerosols, especially the smallest soot particles, which settle in the lowest layer of the atmosphere troposphere and affect the climate. A large part of the energy produced by human beings also has a very harmful effect on the atmosphere and the climate as waste heat, because only a very small part of it radiates into space, so that most of the waste heat remains in the immediate atmospheric environment and has a far-reaching harmful effect, and also rapidly promotes climate change, which of course does not proceed slowly and steadily, but rather is progressing faster and faster due to feedbacks. The whole thing also leads, among other things, to higher temperatures that cause more water to evaporate inexorably in the Amazon, for example, than would normally be the case. This factor, of course, inevitably leads to the rainforest also suffering and withering away, which in turn has the consequence that carbon dioxide is also released as a result. That is to say, not only through the clearing of virgin forest, through the decay and decomposition of the withered trees and plants. Another consequence is the drying out of the soil, trees and plants, which leads to fires caused by any natural or human being-induced factors, which in turn produce enormous masses of CO2. In addition, the rise in CO2 is also accelerating in other ways, namely because global warming is causing the permafrost rocks of the mountains and the permafrost soils to thaw over wide areas. With more than 1.6 trillion tons of carbon dioxide stored in the permafrost soils alone. Since the beginning of industrialization, Earth humans have released just 110 billion tons. In addition to CO2, enormous amounts of methane gas abound in the permafrost, which has an even worse effect on the climate than CO2, if it is understood that this climate gas is about 30 times more effective than carbon dioxide. Further, methane is also bound in enormous quantities in frozen sediments at the bottom of the world's oceans, from where it is released by terrestrial movements and heat, etc., and enters the atmosphere. If it comes to the point where this methane gas thaws as a result of the warming of the seawater, then this will lead to a further drastic change in the average world temperature, increasing it by up to 7 or 8 degrees Celsius. But this is not enough, because very large quantities of methane are also produced by many millions of farm animals, cows, cattle, pigs and poultry, etc., which serve as slaughter animals for meat production, to feed humanity and its domestic animals with meat, and whose numbers are constantly increasing due to the growing demand for meat. If at present earthly mankind, excluding domestic animals, consumes about 360 million tons of meat products annually, this figure is expected to rise to about 530 million tons by the year 2050. The indisputable fact is that carbon dioxide emissions are growing inexorably as a result of the rapidly increasing overpopulation, due to various overpopulation-related causes, such as the increasing use of motor vehicles of all kinds, including cars, ships, aeroplanes, and other means of transport. But also the increasing use of all kinds of working machines, which emit huge amounts of CO2, as well as countless motorized sports vehicles produce huge amounts of carbon dioxide, while millions of animals, poultry and livestock produce gigantic amounts of methane for meat production. And this is not only ongoing today, but also in the future. Effectively, the whole thing has been going on for many decades, ever since the beginning of the inexorably increasing overpopulation and its degenerations and criminal machinations in connection with chemistry, the irresponsible exploitation and poisoning, as well as destruction of many bodies of water, the wars, the resource robbery of every kind, the development of technology, environmental poisoning, environmental destruction, as well as destruction of nature and its fauna and flora, etc., as an inevitable consequence of all this, which goes into the thousands and cannot all be listed. The climate has also been devastatingly affected by the degenerated, criminal and even criminal machinations, which inevitably arose and still arise from overpopulation. Consequently, the climate change, which has a worldwide effect, now brings natural disasters upon natural disasters. This causes tremendous changes in nature and its fauna and flora, which transform the entire ecosystem and cause unimaginable destruction and devastation. Furthermore, catastrophic effects are also increasingly appearing in the existence of human beings themselves, especially in the form of steadily rising unemployment, hatred of asylum seekers, foreigners, people, neighbors, and religion, as well as energy shortages, refugee flows, famines, new diseases and epidemics, water and living space shortages, and growing organized crime and criminality. Among human beings, indifference is becoming more and more blatant, as is misery, enmity, and ill will, while human lives are accorded less and less respect, attention, dignity, and value. Consequently, more and more human beings are killing themselves as a result of weariness and cowardice. And more human beings are being murdered or harassed out of fear, jealousy, hatred, greed for power or money, quarrels, and psychopathic paranoid tendencies and degenerations. In this way, family dramas and fatal family tragedies, as well as suicides, will also increase, as will murderous tendencies of psychopathic, paranoid, jealous people, haters, vindictive people, domineering people, sectarians, and other perpetrators. Many things will also degenerate to such an extent that more and more mass murders will occur and bring a great deal of suffering to human beings. But this is not enough, because in the future there will be more and more vicious quarrels, killings, wars, acts of terrorism and civil which will be carried out by the military, state powers, terrorist organizations of all kinds, such as the homogeneous Islamist state with its constantly emerging criminal offshoots in various states, against which those responsible in the military and states will only take insufficient and lax action. And if one of these groups is fought and destroyed, then two new murderous offshoots emerge in its place, as with the Linnaean Hydra, which rage, murder, destroy, and annihilate in the worst form. Also to be mentioned are wars and acts of terror, which are triggered by dictators, domineering people, politicians, and religious and sectarian fanatics, as well as due to shortages of medicines and food and water. But also the vicious racial hatred of all forms will become blatantly and increasingly widespread, especially promoted by the ever more rampant refugee system from various dictatorial and misanthropic countries of refuge. Sheer racial terror and racial wars will be feared by vicious racist hate groups and racist organizations in a very strong and increased form than is still the case today in 2015. And in this respect, there will be private groups as well as new and similarly oriented organizations, such as in the form of the neo-Nazis, the Aryan Brotherhood and the Aryan Nation, etc., which have existed since the 20th century in Europe, Russia and the USA, as well as in various other countries, and which act and rage just as viciously and even murderously as the Ku Klux Klan, which has been responsible for countless racial murders in the USA since the 19th century. Destruction of human achievements will also occur to an increasing extent in the future, through the degeneracy, viciousness, and wantonness of human beings themselves, as well as through increasing natural disasters. Also hatred, jealousy, and indifference, as well as a lack of relationships, will spread more and more among human beings as a whole, just as the value of human lives will be disregarded more and more, and consequently life and limb will be unhesitatingly, viciously, and wantonly harassed and murdered. Greed, vice, and addictions of all kinds will also increase, as will murder and manslaughter, even in families, schools, and groups, whereby religious, fanatical sectarianism and psychopathic paranoid degenerations will be just as fundamental forms as thought-feeling psychemical disorders and brainwashing factors and alienation from reality, as well as unconscientiousness, etc. Well, the indisputable fact is, even if this is still denied today by mad know-it-alls and experts, as well as by irresponsible scientists, etc., who are paid for this by unscrupulous corporations, that the emissions of carbon dioxide that have taken place so far and that continue to increase enormously are to blame for the global rise in temperature, which may amount to 6 or even 8 degrees by the year 2100, depending on the case. It is also a fact that tropical cyclones increase by up to 35% with each degree of atmospheric heating. But that is not all, because the Arctic and Antarctic will also be affected by the rise in temperature, as the thickness of their ice sheets will decrease as a result of melting, as is also the case with all mountain glaciers throughout the Earth. If global warming continues at the same rate as it has up to now, precisely because of the degenerations in all respects that appear as consequences of overpopulation, then the Arctic may be ice-free in summer in as little as 25 years. And if we consider that the Arctic's ice surface was once up to 7 million square kilometers, but is now only around 3 million square kilometers, then the whole thing offers a bleak picture of the future, which also says that global warming will only increase as a result, because the fact is that the smaller the ice surface, the less sunlight is reflected. Another factor in climate change and ice melt is also that sea levels are rising, currently by about 4.5 mm per year. So it is easy to calculate that by the year 2100, the rise in sea level must already be measured in meters. According to calculations, the melting of inland ice should cause about 45% of the rise in sea levels, while about 55% should be caused by the rise in temperature and the associated expansion of seawater. With regard to the seas, it is also to be said that the coastal countries on the North Sea will have to prepare for higher storm surges, as these will be up to more than 1.50 meters higher than before by the end of the 21st century. A rise in sea level of 55 to 60 centimeters alone will destroy valuable habitats such as alluvial forests, shallow water zones, and salt marshes. A 1-meter rise in sea level on the North and Baltic Seas will submerge some 15,000 square kilometers of coastline and hinterland, with much of the land below the waterline inhabited and farmed by some 4 million human beings at present. But there is another looming scenario for Europe, namely that the warming of the atmosphere may cause a collapse of the Gulf Stream and a new ice age to break over Europe, which is not yet considered likely but may have to be taken into account. Climate change is also causing more and more violent geological changes on planet Earth itself, such as landslides, and debris flows due to the thawing of permafrost and rainstorms. On the Earth's surface and on the seabed, cracks in the Earth's mantle, and consequently major shifts in the Earth's mantle are occurring, in addition to which ever more gigantic primordial hurricanes and tsunamis are breaking over the Earth, causing catastrophic destruction in nature and to human buildings of all kinds, and also costing many thousands and thousands of human lives. The traditional laws of nature will come apart at the seams and change drastically in new forms, leading to new geological as well as natural changes to which humanity will inevitably have to adapt, or if it does not, perish. The whole process of adapting also means that a worldwide birth stop and, of course, a global birth control will have to take place, but also that all human machinations of any kind that destroy nature, fauna, flora, and the climate, as well as all other degenerated human machinations worldwide, will have to come to an end once and for all. But there is another scenario, namely that by the year 2100, the globally increased temperature will lead to severe droughts. And also the Amazon rainforest will be affected and up to 75% destroyed, if the whole destruction continues as it is caused by the degenerate machinations of overpopulation. However, it is already clear that earthly humanity and its governments and all those responsible will not take any measures to stop the growth of the world's population, as would be necessary through an appropriate birth stop and radical birth control in a worldwide form. But this will also be the case with regard to the destruction of the Amazon region, where in the best case scenario, the destroyed rainforest areas will become grass and shrub savannas or lifeless wasteland. But that is not all, because southern Europe and the southwest of the USA, as well as Southwest Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and large parts of Australia could also be subject to destructive droughts in the future, which would then have a very adverse effect on the regional climate. Inevitably, more and more bush areas would emerge, far exceeding anything known so far. And the fact that these new dry periods will also lead to huge crop losses everywhere is also unavoidable. But elsewhere, the dangers of unusually huge floods will also increase, for example in Western South America, as well as in New Zealand, in Northern Australia and in Eastern China, etc., while in temperate regions, such as Northern Europe, Canada and South America, there will be more arable land as a result of climate change, which will naturally lead to higher crop yields, which is also related to the fact that various food and wild plants grow better and faster with higher CO2 levels. But it will also result in other foreign animals, Birds and all kinds of foreign land and water creatures from foreign countries are climatizing and settling, not only through introduction as a result of criminal globalization, but also through climate-induced direct immigration. At present, as well as in the future, climate change is causing the greatest damage and destruction in poor countries, although industrialized countries will not be spared either. Overall and globally, the damage caused by climate change, its effects and natural disasters will run into billions of Swiss francs. If we only think of the rise in the global sea level, which, if it rises by only half a metre, will threaten around 140 million coastal cities, then we can roughly calculate that enormous human achievements and assets will be destroyed by the rising waters, which must also be calculated as damage values in the billions of Swiss francs. But the expected scenario could go so far that even entire states could disappear from the Earth's surface, such as the approximately 1,200 islands of the Maldives, because their highest elevation is only just 2.40 m above sea level. If the sea level rises by even half a metre, this will mean, and this is very likely to happen, that a large part of the islands will become uninhabitable. It should also be said that global warming is causing seawater to penetrate further and further into the mainland, both into the soil that is cultivated for food crops and into the vital groundwater that serves the human beings as drinking water and irrigation water for the fields. The greatest sufferers from the effects of climate change are effectively, as mentioned, the poor countries and their human beings, even though they have only contributed a small part to global warming as a whole, which will also continue to be the case. And as far as the resources are concerned, which are plundered in these countries by corporations of the industrialized countries, the human beings of these poor countries are hardly involved in this, if at all, if they have any resources at all in their country. But this is not enough, because the consequences of climate change alone are creating problems in poor countries that can no longer be overcome. If in this regard the coming droughts are mentioned, which will inevitably come, then the barren fields will dry up and become even more completely infertile. Consequently, as mentioned, famines will also increase. In addition, the sources of water will dry up due to the drought, whereby the human beings as well as nature and its fauna and flora will be confronted with such a lack of water that death will become more and more widespread among the human beings as well as in the fauna and flora. Water bodies will also suffer from the drought and, of course, shipping will suffer from their sinking, as will hydroelectric power plants, because far more than half of the water taken from nature is consumed in the energy industry, especially with regard to nuclear power plants, which need river water to cool their facilities. Thus, in the future, if these power plants are not shut down early for reasons of common sense, this will have to be done when the lack of water no longer allows water to be wasted for such power plants. In contrast to this, there is at the same time the increasing energy consumption for air conditioning and the daily energy consumption for households, agriculture and industry, in relation to the unchecked and ever more rapidly increasing overpopulation. Furthermore, the coming heat and drought will lead to harvest losses in regional parts of Europe, while in other regions. However, agriculture can expect good and even increasing yields because new types of grain are being bred that require very little moisture and will also be more resistant to heat than today's varieties. In parts of Europe, the heat will increasingly exceed 40 degrees Celsius and cause enormous problems for human beings. As far as forests are concerned, increasing global warming will cause spruce trees to die because this tree species tends to require a cooler climate. As a result, tree species such as maple, beech, oak and southern tree species, which are more resistant to heat and drought, will increasingly replace the northern conifers. So a large part of the native trees will disappear in the whole of Earth because of climate change. Although, as I said, more and more species from southern Europe and other regions of Earth will gain a foothold in Europe, as will also be the case with animals, insects, birds, aquatic life and all kinds of creatures. In particular, those genera and species that were previously only spring, summer and autumn visitors will now settle in Central and Northern Europe for good and remain all year round. So it is also clear that winters throughout Europe will be much milder and wetter than today. This will naturally also reduce the need for heating everywhere, as will the periods of frost and cold. Nevertheless, heavy storms and torrential rain will occur in winter, with much flooding, mudslides and inundations causing havoc and great destruction, as well as bringing much suffering, distress and misery to human beings. Frost and snow will steadily diminish and thus decrease considerably due to climate change, estimated down to lower altitudes below 900 meters. Of course, this will also put a strain on winter sports facility operators and cause them to go bankrupt because the mountain areas will become snow-free. Unreasonably, ski slopes are first maintained with artificial snow, which of course again requires enormous amounts of energy as well as water, until these two can no longer be applied, and their use must ultimately be abandoned or banned. With regard to Central and Northern Europe, the effects of climate change will be relatively minor in terms of drought catastrophes, which will cause tremendous changes in those countries that will be affected by them, and where there will also be a tremendous lack of water. Nevertheless, the whole of Europe will also suffer from droughts and water shortages. But there will also be an increase in natural storms and severe flooding, which will cause great disasters, damage and destruction, and cost many human lives. Of course, the annual mean temperature will also rise in the long term, with up to 4 or even 7 degrees to be expected by the year 2100, depending on how further destruction of nature, its fauna and flora and climate change develop as a result of the continued enormous growth and degenerative measures of overpopulation. What is certain, however, is that the summers will become hotter and drier all over Europe, and consequently the summer temperatures will rise to 30 degrees or more, even in the shade. This means that the human beings living in Central and Northern Europe, who are not used to such high temperatures, will then experience difficulties in living because ozone and smog will cause dangerous damage to the bronchial tubes and lungs, as well as increasing death rates from heat exhaustion or heart attacks. At this coming time, an increase in mortality rates of up to 6% per additional degree of heat must be expected in Europe as a result of increasing global warming, precisely because Central and Northern Europeans are not used to high heat. However, this Europe-wide temperature increase, which is accompanied by a shift in climate zones, will also bring new diseases and epidemics, especially those from southern countries, with malaria, along with other tropical diseases and also serious epidemics, at the forefront. But not only the summers of the future, but also the spring and autumn seasons will take their toll in terms of damage to the health of Europeans, such as tick bites in the early summer season, causing Lyme disease and meningitis meningoencephalitis. Skin cancer will also reap rich harvests as a result of the ever more aggressive solar radiation, not only in summer, but also in spring and autumn. But due to the climatic changes, chemical toxins applied to natural foodstuffs will also cause hitherto unknown changes, whereby human beings will become increasingly ill with allergies and gastrointestinal disorders. If we look at the glaciers in more detail, we can say that the future melting of the Himalayan glaciers alone will be a catastrophe for more than 1.5 billion human beings, because the lack of water will claim its victims with terrible consequences. In India alone, when the great droughts come, the continued existence of meagre agriculture will become a huge problem, directly affecting about 65–75% of the population. But also in northern China, as in other countries, areas of land will wither and become desolate, or otherwise desert-like areas will continue to spread. In the future, droughts, but also destructive floods and all kinds of storms and earthquakes will drive many African, Central Asian, and Southeast Asian countries into state collapse. And just as the worldwide refugee system has already spread on a large scale, as was predicted in the 1950s and even later, the great migrations and exodus of peoples will only begin correctly. While today the number of refugees per year is still manageable for the countries taking them in 35 to 50 years there will be about 350 million refugees who will leave their homeland as a result of climate change and its catastrophic consequences, and also as a result of negative and difficult political, military, religious and terrorist unrest and machinations, and seek new refuge in foreign countries all over the world, whereby Europe in particular, as is already the case today, will be favoured. And this is the case with all the masses of refugees coming from all over the world, but especially from Africa and Arabia, and landing on Italian and Greek islands or on the mainland in large soul cellars and ramshackle wooden and rubber boats. If they do not capsize first, fall into the sea, or are thrown in by the smugglers and drown. So the longer and the more, and already from the present time onwards, the refugee flows will become ever more enormous and extensive, as well as uncontrollable, not only from the continent of Africa, but also from the Balkan and Eastern states, from various states in South America, as well as from Asia and the Near and Far East. As a result, the authorities, politicians, aid organizations, surveillance and security forces of the countries into which the refugees are entering or migrating are no longer able to cope with the resulting problems. As a result, refugee camps will be built from demolished houses, army buildings, barracks, containers, tent cities and wild camps, etc., where untenable and miserable hygienic conditions will prevail, as well as attacks and quarrels with nasty consequences among the refugees of different states, religions, sex, and social classes crammed together in camps. Crime, disease, epidemics, murder, and manslaughter are also spreading inexorably, and an inadequate supply of food and drinking water will also contribute greatly to all the evils that will arise. So even in the refugee camps, there will soon be a lack of food and water, and jealousy, hatred, quarrels and fights will arise among the refugees themselves, which will also cause injuries and possibly deaths. The longer, the more a real refugee chaos in various forms will arise, as also for all state security organs, such as supervisory, guarding, police and customs officials, unmanageable control, regulation, and surveillance conditions and other problems will appear at the national borders and in the countries themselves. In addition, in the countries of refuge, the flow of refugees, mostly economic migrants entering Europe in particular, but also other countries, is causing more and more serious problems among the national populations. Their authorities, governments, politicians, and political parties with regard to contradictory, false humanist views and opinions in favor of admitting or not admitting, or accepting or rejecting, as well as the treatment, rights, and deportation of the steadily increasing number of refugees. What is already happening today through the refugee system and what will inexorably increase in the future is a mixing of the world's population that can no longer be stopped because the causes that have already been set. The refugee flows are not being stopped for false humanitarian reasons. Therefore, an unstoppable and worldwide mixture of races and peoples will be just as unavoidable as also the emergence of a new mixed-race humanity, as well as a mixture of religions and their sects, which will also give rise to multiple enmities and hatreds. Through climate change, the whole thing will become a consequence in this way. But the whole world will be affected by it, because the changing climate will steadily increase the number of weak and fragile states from which streams of refugees will result. So, of course, the further consequence will be that serious distribution conflicts will arise in all refugee-hosting countries, and on an exuberant scale that dwarfs anything that is already the case in Europe today, as the EU dictatorship dictates to its member states how many refugees they must accept. Conclusion. Reason and rationality must be clearly demanded and expressed, as well as that all nations of the world must in future limit all kinds of emissions just as drastically worldwide as they do the over-exploitation of resources. Furthermore, the use of chemicals in nature and its fauna and flora, and thus all chemical and waste-related environmental pollution, environmental poisoning and environmental destruction must be banned and stopped immediately, just as the rapidly increasing overpopulation must be stopped by introducing and enforcing a worldwide and state-controlled and effective birth regulation very quickly. Only in this way can the comprehensive human tragedy still be mitigated, which is looming threateningly in the Earth-human's destiny sky and is already bringing drastic and malignant negative as well as catastrophic and destructive consequences worldwide. Not only all the dirt in the air is changing the climate, but also all the consequences of human degenerations and destructions in relation to nature, its fauna and flora, and the climate. The whole of today's natural disasters is an urgent warning of the consequences of climate change. If this is not counteracted very quickly, the Earth will ultimately no longer be able to meet even the most necessary needs of humanity, as a result of which the ever-increasing demand for energy, food and water can no longer be met. If nothing is done to the best of our ability, the whole of all the degenerate machinations brought about by overpopulation will lead to an inevitable, all-encompassing human tragedy. Therefore, all nations of the world are called upon to seize the only small chance they still have to avoid this tragedy. This, however, requires first and foremost that a controlled worldwide birth stop is achieved and a worldwide birth control is introduced. so that overpopulation is quickly curtailed, and nature and its fauna and flora, as well as the climate, can recover from all the destruction caused by the degenerate machinations of overpopulation. The time has long since passed when lax, idiotic, useless and unhelpful international climate protection agreements can still be adopted. For what is needed now is understanding and reason, and decisive, drastic, clear, useful and valuable action in order to ultimately prevent the Earth-human being tragedy that threatens us in the future. Appendix Area of Switzerland. If the total areas of all mountains and hills in Switzerland are added to the base area measure, then the total area of Switzerland comprises over 80,000 square kilometres. The area of Switzerland, as is taught in school, is 41,285 square kilometres. However, this is wrong if only the simple base area is calculated without the total areas of all mountains and hills. Switzerland is at least twice as large, more than 80,000 square kilometres, if the total surface area, and thus also the areas or steep faces, rocks, slopes, etc. of the mountains and hills are calculated. This is also proven by the latest measurements and calculations, with very precise height models and fast computers, as Swissdopo has recalculated the true surface of Switzerland for MTW Menschen Technik Wissenschaft, down to the last detail. So the 41,285 square kilometres would only be correct if all the mountains and hills in Switzerland were completely flat. Sim Yase, Silver Star Centre, the 21st of July 2015, 22:39 hours Billy.
I have of course accurately noted and carefully studied this article as well as the others. The data in your article Environmental Destruction as Result of Overpopulation match with the rightness. You can therefore publish it in a bulletin, as I assume that this is what you want to do. You should, however, not consider the Zeitzeichen for this purpose, because it being of another character than the bulletins and special bulletins, that's why it is not suitable for such articles. I want in that respect further on to say that this paperwork is of significance and importance. That's why us from the committee to which I have submitted the article express the desire that it gets as quickly as possible issued on the internet, and in that way spread worldwide. It should also, as quickly as feasible, get translated into other languages and as translation too published on the internet. Even though all other earthly languages but German are very poor in expression and deficient. But the aim of it all can also, in these inadequate languages, be well understood and comprehended.
That surprises me, as we were supposed to no longer translate anything into English or other languages. That was your decision in the committee.
You should indeed not do that, or more precisely, the members of the core group should no longer deal with such work. What other persons, also individuals or FIGU groups in other countries are doing in respect of translations into other languages that is outside the remit of the core group members at the parent center. That is also to say that the FIGU groups of other countries should strive to translate this article as well. As all other feasible articles along with A5 and A4 booklets into their national languages and to put them into the internet, plus spread them otherwise. It would further on be important for it to reach governing persons and the Pope for their inspection and study. It should also be made available at the information booths and further on be disseminated by distribution actions.
This would require creating a A5 booklet from it.
That is the wish of our committee too.
That being the case, we will strive for it. But what about us in the FIGU Parent Center receiving those translations, as you have mentioned them, from other persons or FIGU groups for publication on the net?
The rule should be that in case a parent center page in corresponding language exists, those translations may very well be accepted and published in the respective language section on the Internet. Otherwise, translations created by the respective persons and FIGU groups should be published on own Internet pages. Likewise, should all articles and so on translated into other languages be dealt with when decontrolled as end products by the FIGU parent center. On that, we have today also taken decisions. We have thus reached a verdict that, apart from books, all brochures, booklets and thus also articles and so on should be decontrolled extensively for translation. Consequently, only works in books require thus an authorization for translation into foreign languages. The justification for our respective advice is the following. We have noted that already since years worldwide all FIGU articles, FIGU brochures and other FIGU booklets existing on the Internet or disseminated in written form are translated into various languages and brought in circulation without acquiring an oral or written permission. The whole matter has that way evolved in a manner that it can by no means be overseen anymore, and thus also no longer controlled. Would one therefore stick to granting of permissions, it would only become hindering, counterproductive, and irrational, as well as impairing with regard to the internal and external activity.
Very nice. It is thus no longer necessary to obtain special permits for it from us in the FIGU Parent Center. That saves again work and makes several things easier. On that, I am thinking that in contrast to the advantages, also disadvantages will again evolve. This by way of distortions caused by translations in the manner described by you.
That will of course be so, because certain words, synonyms, and descriptions, etc., as existing in the German language, can in no way be translated into other languages or otherwise expressed. However, that can unfortunately not be avoided, but on the other hand, such translations ensure that the values of the teaching get disseminated worldwide and bear their fruit.
Thus, obtaining of a translation permit applies only to books for which the obligation exists that during the publishing of a book translated into a foreign language, the original German text has mandatorily to be added.
That corresponds to the relevant provisions, which do not apply in relation to articles and booklets with respect to translations into other languages.
Then the whole thing is clear. However, what about the articles of statutes and bylaws which we have been working on for months and that urgently need to be cleared up? I had also given the two girls those articles as copies, so you and Quetzal, as well as the committee, would be able to decide about it and reach an assessment.
To this end, we met in the panel a few hours ago and decided on this. To that end, it is now necessary for me to show you on the pages the necessary changes or additions that you are to put in.
Of course. Here I have the originals. Now, if you will explain to me.
Take note of everything as I explain it to you. Then I will start with Article 39. That is all. And now what comes up with Article 11 is the following.
Then that is all?
Correct. Now, as for the reader's question regarding bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps, the answer to which you also handed over to Florina and Enjana, and which they also sent to me because I am also interested in it, you have given a very good answer to that.
Question. What is it about bee, bumblebee, and wasp, stings that are very dangerous to human beings and animals, as well as that 3 hornet stings kill a human being, and 7 hornet stings kill a horse, and that Asian killer hornets are supposed to wipe out honeybees? A. Meister, Switzerland.
Answer. First of all, it is to be said that many human beings are not aware of the differences between bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps. Therefore, the following will briefly explain the differences, whereby please note that the description should not be understood as a scientific treatise with a claim to completeness, but rather as a colloquial description in relation to the insects mentioned. In the presence of bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps, calmness should be maintained in any case, as well as hectic movements should be avoided. This also applies in particular to bumblebees, which, although also equipped with a stinger, are the most peaceful of the sting-armed insects. Wasps are often found at dining tables, but not bees or bumblebees. Especially sweet foods like cake or jam, but also meat dishes and drinks, attract wasps. Bees and bumblebees are not attracted at all, although honey is an exception. It should be noted that if wasps make an appearance while eating and may feast on the food, it should not be accidentally put in the mouth with the food, as this can lead to extremely unpleasant complications, reactions, and pain if a wasp sting occurs in the mouth area. Wasps can be chased away, but this should not necessarily be recommended, because wasps become aggressive when they are waved around and chased away. Shooing away bees and hornets should also be avoided, because they also feel provoked by such action, become aggressive, and can sting. And with regard to stinging, there is an essential difference between the bees and the wasp species, to which the hornet also belongs. Bees die when they have stung a human being. This is in contrast to hornets and other wasp species, which survive a sting in human skin without any consequences. However, bees die because their sting is equipped with a barb that ensures that the sting gets stuck in the human skin when the bee stings. The bee cannot retract the stinger after the sting, so it is torn out of the abdomen together with the venom sac, which ultimately leads to the death of the bee. What is certain, however, is that the death of a single bee is of no consequence, because the survival of the colony takes precedence over the individual bee's life. If you are stung by a bee, a hornet, or another wasp species, you should check for allergic reactions and, if in doubt, consult a doctor. If, for any plausible and logical reason, bee, hornet, or other wasp nests have to be removed, it must always be remembered that these are nests of very beneficial insects that should not be destroyed or only in extreme emergencies. Thus, in the case of nest removal, relocation should always be considered, but not destruction and annihilation, because nest destruction should only be carried out if there is a very urgent emergency due to danger to human beings, and a nest cannot be removed, and moreover, no protective measure can be implemented. It is very important that a sufficient distance is chosen for relocation, because the insects often fly several kilometers back to their original nest. As a rule, the removal or relocation should not be carried out by laymen, but by an experienced specialist, whereby the fire brigade is often predestined for such actions. If the bee, hornet, or wasp nest does not pose a danger, it is also possible to simply wait until the insects die in autumn. Consequently, the paper-like nests, which are only ever inhabited for 1 year, then remain empty. The fact is that it corresponds to an old-fashioned fear, an extremely stupid know-it-all attitude, and fairy tale that 3 hornet stings would kill a human being and 7 hornet stings would kill a horse. Also, that the alleged killer hornets Vespa velutina, brought to France from Asia as a result of globalization, which will also slowly spread throughout Europe, threaten and exterminate honeybees, is truthfully based on absolute nonsense and an irresponsible newspaper sensationalist fairy tale. These untruths and truth-devouring assertions and factual slander through stupid speeches and stupidly sensationalist press false reports naturally spread at breakneck speed and create a climate of anxiety, threat, fear, and unpleasant thoughts and feelings, not infrequently to the point of hysteria and panic. In truth, however, the whole thing must be dealt with very objectively. Although nothing must be played down either, as for example in relation to the dangers for allergy sufferers when they are stung by bees, hornets, or other wasps. Normally, however, there is no danger at all for human beings, because in reality it is good to live together with hornets, also with Asian hornets, if calmness and common sense are maintained. With regard to the Asian hornet, which has already become native to Europe, it is to be said that it is no threat whatsoever to honeybees, because at most weakened bee colonies can or could be affected. This is also true when the Asian hornet preys on honeybees in order to rear its larvae, just as the hornets native to Europe do. However, this is absolutely irrelevant, because in strong honeybee colonies the queen bee lays up to 2,000 eggs per day, so the preying of isolated honeybees by the native or the Asian hornets is of no importance at all. The whole of the demonizing press reports and ridiculous folklore concerning hornets and wasps in general, as well as specifically concerning the Asian hornet, has fundamentally nothing to do with the Japanese hornet Vespa mandarina, which is effectively aggressive and which is probably not infrequently mistakenly regarded as the Asian hornet and thus confused, and which moreover, at least at present, is not yet making a name for itself in Europe. The Asian hornet, which has several thousand individuals per colony, usually builds its nest, which can be up to 1 meter high and 80 centimeters wide, at a height of more than 10 meters in the treetops, so that it can hardly be seen if dense foliage prevails. It is also a fact that hornets, like wasps and bees, are basically peaceful insect contemporaries, and as insect hunters, do not attack and sting human beings or animals for no reason. As a rule, they all only become aggressive when they are harassed and disturbed by human beings or animals, especially when their nests and brood are disturbed or destroyed. Bees, hornets, and wasps are neither vicious nor dangerous if left alone. Every year bees, hornets, and wasps come, and every year many human beings are frightened and annoyed for no reason at all by these insects, which are really quite harmless if left alone and not disturbed or annoyed. Unfortunately, there are always many newspaper reports regarding the dangerousness of these insects, which unnecessarily increases the fear or even dread of these conspicuous creatures. However, exaggerated fear or scaremongering through sensational reports does not do justice to either bees or hornets and wasps. Firstly, a bee is harmless if left alone. And further, not every yellow-black insect is also a hornet or wasp. And secondly, only 2 species of wasps become a nuisance in the worst case if they are disturbed or made to attack by flailing around. When people think of hornets and wasps, they first think of the yellow and black insects with the dreaded sting. But wasp is also the name for almost all insects called Hymenoptera. Only bees, bumblebees, and ants are given their own name in this group. With regard to wasps, there are leaf wasps, digger wasps, wood wasps, ichneumon wasps, path wasps, and many others. Wasps are actual insect hunters. For example, a worker wasp captures a winged ant and cuts off its legs, head, and wings to then feed the portioned prey to larvae in the wasp nest. In late summer, male sexuals drones also appear, which, unlike female wasps, have a longer abdomen and one more abdominal ring, as well as a longer antenna limb, which allows them to be distinguished from worker wasps. Male wasps do not have a defensive sting, consequently they cannot sting. Wasps of all species, including hornets, can build their nests in very different places, such as in a birdhouse, in a shutterbox, under house roofs, in hollow trees and walls, while other species of wasps build their nests in the soil of meadows, etc., wood from tree trunks, fence posts, or garden furniture, etc., is moistened and then scraped off with the mandibles formed into a ball of paper and taken to the nest, where the material is immediately used to expand the nest shell or build honeycombs. The wasps that are particularly disliked by human beings are species of the wrinkled wasps. This name describes a peculiarity of the wing, which is folded lengthwise when at rest. Unfounded fear, dread, and bad press give wasps above-average attention. However, if human beings would learn more about these insects, they would find answers to the same questions over and over again. Are wasps really poisonous and dangerous? What do they have a sting for? Do hornets and wasps need to be protected, and how can human beings protect themselves from them? How must human beings behave in general with regard to bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps? It must be said that an encounter with these useful insects is usually associated with anxiety, fear, and insecurity on the part of those human beings who know nothing at all about these creatures. The fact is that as a rule, there is no cause for fear or anxiety, because with understanding, sensible behavior, and a little knowledge, there is no danger whatsoever of being stung by such an insect. This is also the case if bees, hornets, bumblebees, or wasps have nested in the nearby vicinity, which can be very interesting objects of observation for young and old. Bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps are not aggressive in principle, so they can be observed and studied very well from a close distance, even if you stay calm. The situation is different with the Africanized American honeybees, which, however, do not yet occur in Europe. These are honeybees in the tropical and subtropical zones of the American double continent. They are repeatedly created by mixing crossing, bee colonies managed by beekeepers with occasionally added queens of European descent, and drones of dominant wild bee colonies of African descent. Both these hybrids, and also just the wild bees, are often referred to as killer bees because of their aggressiveness. The following is recommended when single or multiple bees, hornets, bumblebees, or wasps, or even whole swarms occur, or when their nests are established in human surroundings. Behavior with bees. If a swarm of bees appears, please do not disturb it, but inform a local beekeeper immediately before the insects move on. Bee swarms should be caught by experts within a reasonable period of time and passed on to the beekeepers. If one or more bees appear in general, they should not be agitated by waving them around, because if they are kept calm, they will not start to defend themselves, which would lead to defensive stings. Behavior with wasps. When wasps appear, no action is necessary, only thoughtful calm. The presence of these insects and their nests does not usually require any action, because if the insects are not disturbed or made aggressive by waving their hands and arms or objects around, then they remain peaceful and harmless. In the case of wasps of any kind in general, the same principle applies as with bees, because wasps should also not be made agitated by waving them around. Also in this case, if calm is maintained, then no defensive agitation will emanate from them, leading to attacks and defensive stings. Behavior with hornets. No immediate action necessary. Hornets are relatively peaceful, but if their nest or surroundings are disturbed or agitated by vibrations, then the hornets resort to a massive defense by attacking anything that can be moved, with a radius of 2 to 6 meters, depending on the colony. In September or October at the latest, the states perish. Only the young queens overwinter. The same behavioral pattern applies to hornets as to all wasps and bees. So when hornets appear, keep calm and don't flail around, so these insects don't attack or sting. If a human being is stung by a bee, a hornet more rarely by a bumblebee or another wasp. The best way is to quickly move away from the area of such insects, because a sting releases alarm pheromones that attract other human beings and make them aggressive and thus ready to sting. Thus, a greater distance of about 10–20 meters from the site of the stung insect should be quickly gained. A sting is painful and afterwards also somewhat burning. But if there is no danger of allergy, which under certain exceptional circumstances can be life-threatening, then the pain will quickly subside and cause no harm. A possible danger from stings by bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps therefore only exists in the case of severe allergy sufferers, who make up about 4–5% of the population. However, a severe and dangerous allergy usually only develops after several stings, although in the case of severe allergy sufferers, even 1–2 stings can have nasty effects. According to statistics, the death rate in Europe is very low, about 1/5,660,000, so allergy sufferers need not panic unnecessarily as a result of stings by bees, hornets, and other wasps. Now, anyone who has a nest of wild bees, hornets, bumblebees, or wasps in their house, in a birdhouse, in the garden, in the ground, in a barn, in a hollow tree or in a meadow, etc., should really be happy about this, because it can be recognized and observed that the insect queen has established a state and no longer needs to fly out. This means that she now devotes herself to laying eggs and is cared for by all her numerous following female offspring, the workers, until autumn. These fly in and out and forage far and wide. Bees and bumblebees nectar, hornets and wasps various insects, and all sorts of other nutritious things, to feed the larvae in their various stages. Others build the nest incessantly, while others patrol the nest entrance to secure it and ward off foreign intruders. If the bees, hornets, bumblebees, and wasps are disturbed at the immediate entrance, or in the immediate vicinity of the nest area, they naturally react very sensitively, even aggressively. In Europe alone, there are thousands of species of wasps, which also includes Hornets vespa crabro, which is one of the largest wasp species, along with various even larger plant wasps. Queens can grow to 3.5 centimeters and workers to 2.5 centimeters. There are 18 known social and 230 solitary wrinkled wasps, Eumenidae, as well as about 700 plant wasps and over 8,000 parasitic insects. Hornets in particular are much more shy than honeybees. As a result, they tend to flee rather than attack, even at a distance of about 2 to 3 meters from their nest. A hornet colony comprises 100–700 individuals, depending on the situation, but when threatened, only a part of them will defend the nest. And when the hornet's venom is examined, it is found to be less poisonous than that of a honeybee. This is proven by scientific experiments in which animals weighing 1 kilogram were killed by 40 bee stings, while the same animals of the same weight died only after 150–180 hornet stings. For a human being, the estimates are that there is no danger to life from hornet venom until there are more than 1,000 hornet stings. Simya-se Silver Star Center, the 4th of August 2015, 22:58 hours Billy.